Well, cooperative banks are, the key leaders as regard the retail banking industry in Europe, with a market share of around 20%. And at the timing, there are more than 4,000 cooperative banks in Europe. Cooperative banks are really active to finance the real economy. We are proximity banks, and you can find this feature everywhere in Europe, at least in the old countries of the European Union, because it's more difficult in the new countries. Proximity banks, we finance families, households, small and medium enterprises. This is the core business of a local cooperative banks. Cooperative banks are also organized in networks with usually 2 or 3 levels: local banks, regional banks, and the apex body. Local banks or regional banks are affiliated to the apex body. The role of the apex body is to manage the risk for the group, to manage the liquidity for the group, and sometimes, depending on the mandate given by the supervisory authorities, also to supervise local banks. These are, I would say, in a nutshell, in a very short, the main features of cooperative banks. I would say that the regulators and the supervisors in different countries are quite impressed by the solidity and the resilience of cooperative banks. 2 or 3 years, the former European Commissions thought that cooperative banks was an old-fashioned business model, which will disappear very shortly. And during the crisis, cooperative banks were, I would say, really less affected by the negative impact of the financial crisis. And we have demonstrated during these 2 years, 3 years, that we are really solid institutions which contribute to the stability of the financial industry. There are 2 or 3 key drivers in terms of regulation. Of course, the first one is the European Commissions, because we have to take into consideration that 80% of the European legislation is decided, of course, in Brussels, but 80% of the Italian banking legislation is designed in Brussels. So this is why it's so important to be present in Brussels. So on one side, the European Commission. On the other side, the European Parliament. The European Parliament is very helpful for cooperative banks because the European parliamentary, the MEPs, the Member of Parliament, are elected and comes from the local level. So they know, at least in their regions, the weight, the importance of cooperative banks. And now there is also a new authorities at the European level, which is the European supervisory authorities, and specifically the European banking authorities, which will play a very important and relevant role in the future concerning the definition of the regulations. Well, concerning the key concerns of cooperative banks as regard Basel III, there are at least one key concern is about the definition of the core tier 1 capital and the reconnections of cooperative shares as core tier 1 capital. Second concern is about the definition of the liquidity standards, because the liquidity standard will impact the business model of the retail banks and specifically their role as intermediary bank. And we are not today able to assess exactly what will be the impact, but in any case it will impact our core business models. Then there are also, beyond, this Basel III, other initiatives such as, the crisis management resolutions, the deposit guarantee schemes, and what we ask for the European institutions is to make a kind of a cumulative impact of all these legislations in order to assess the impact on one side on the banking industry, on the other side on the real economy. because you are definitively convinced that the application of Basel III as it is will impact the financing of the real economy. That means at the end of the day, the financing of SMEs and which may have an impact on the growth and on the employment. So concerning the future, the relationship of Basel III, we have also to take into consideration the role of the Basel III in the design of the regulation at the international level. Of course, Basel III is mainly devoted to supervise, to design the legislation for international banks. But at the European level, the European Commission use Basel III and make a kind of copy and paste of Basel III or Basel's recommendation in the EU legislation. And this is a challenge for cooperative banks because the Basel Committee is composed with 27 countries, but among these 27 countries, only 9 of them are European countries. That means that we are in minority in the Basel Committee, and in this respect, we have to convince the Chinese regulators, the Brazilian regulators, the Russian regulators, how it's important for them also to take into consideration the specificities of the European cooperative banks.